Hello everyone. In this video I'd like to talk about sculpture in the second grade. So sculpture is a great opportunity for students to build dexterity, hand strength, and also to consider the differences in forms between physical objects. But a little beyond that, which would be really fixed sculpture, sculpture is an opportunity, or modeling class as many schools call it, is an opportunity to look at gesture. Not only the gesture of how things might move or be posed, but also gesture as in how are physical forms shaped in our world. Now, sculpture is a great chance to do that because second graders love to make things with their hands. There is very little that will stop them from playing and fidgeting. As a matter of fact, giving them a piece of beeswax for a child who might have difficulty with attentive tasks or with playing with things is a really good thing for them to do. It's a good way to stay occupied. And so frequently in my class, choosing to work with beeswax was something that students would do during free times, or if we were forced to have inside recess, or other opportunities like that. Now, when working with modeling, I do prefer beeswax in the second grade. I've worked with clay as well and found that both can be really effective. But I do choose beeswax because I like the resistance that it creates in the sculptural object. I also like that setup and cleanup are a little bit easier. So by saving clay, which has a different set of technical challenges for later in the grades, that allows you to build up that process with older students. So by working in sculpture, the format that I would spend with my classes would be to start class by passing out new materials. Often that was something that the children really loved. I would not tell them what we were making. They wouldn't have heard a story yet. And so as soon as I started to come around with the basket of beeswax, then they were beginning to guess what it might be. And this is such a good exercise for second graders to apply their memory to stories that they've heard before. They knew that our sculpture would likely come from a story, and then trying to guess what it could be based on the color of beeswax or several colors or what they might have heard or seen. That kind of predictive capacity is a really good bridge to critical thinking later. And so they would start guessing. As soon as they started getting their beeswax, I would ask them to begin warming it. And after every child had some beeswax, I would start to talk to them while I was warming my own, telling them a story, maybe retelling a part of a story that they had already heard, or talking about a character or an animal in a story in greater depth. A quick point about that, I did not do any sculptures of human being figures in the second grade with my class. I prefer to wait for sculpting human beings until after they've worked into the third grade curriculum and approached the 9-year change a little bit more. There's a different gesture that comes with sculpting a human being, and also especially with how those human being sculptures will interact with one another. So for my class, I chose to stay with mostly animals, insects, and plant forms, and they loved it. The big change from first grade was that in second grade we started to use more than one color of beeswax at times, so we might add a few pieces for details. And frequently at the end of a sculpture lesson, I kept a basket of really little tiny pieces of recycled beeswax that they were allowed to come up and choose pieces to add details into their figure, as long as it was something that really fit with the character. And they loved that. It was a way to personalize their work. It also kept them going for those who might have finished the sculpture a little quicker. And it was a nice chance for them to really also build in new habits, new techniques, use them on their own. So that's what we would do for sculpture class, and I'll give you an example now of a sculpture I might have done with my second grade. I hope you enjoy. So let's go ahead and do an example sculpture. First, a few notes about materials. I do like using modeling beeswax. The stuff available from Mercurius is really great. For the second grade, I found that about 1/3 of a block was about the right size for most students, although some of my students did better with about 1/4 of a stick size. And I personally like to use about 1/2 of a stick size, generally enough that it fits in the palm of their hand when it's made into a ball. And making the beeswax into a ball was always the first step that we used. Moving from that archetypal form of the circle or the sphere and then metamorphosizing it into other forms is really the inner plastic experience that you want the students to have, that flexibility in thinking that says from this form, other forms can be created. It gives them that sense that everything is held in the single, and that within the single lives the opportunity to represent everything. And that's the kind of gesture that you really want them to take in second grade. So starting at the ball, we would spend some time while I was telling a story or giving a description while they were warming their beeswax. Occasionally in the winter months, I might do a little pre-warming for them in a basket on the windowsill, but generally they knew that they would warm the beeswax by squeezing it and holding it in their hands. Now, it is possible certainly to do things like putting it into your armpit to warm it, places like that, and I've seen that work pretty well. But I really liked with my class trying to emphasize that I wanted them to work with their hands to really build the strength of their hands, and that by squeezing the beeswax, they were warming it. They were also building real strength in their hands. Similarly, when we began to work with the beeswax, we would work it with our fingertips and thumbs, so avoiding any rolling on the table or squeezing it with other implements. I leave sculpture tools until about the 4th grade. So starting with that circular form, I might start to tell them a little bit about the shape of the frog that they would be making. And this would, of course, be on the tail end of hearing a story where the frog had both a personality and a gesture. And so by talking about it, I might start by saying that the frog's body and their head are really pretty closely connected. So we could start by just bringing out, pinching a little bit at one end to start to form where that head is, but that we didn't really want to create a neck per se. Then I might say that we would start working to flatten the body a little bit, keeping it nice and round, because of course this frog doesn't have a tail, but beginning to flatten the body, but leaving the head up a little bit. Now, sculpture is something that I do with my class, so I would be doing this while also giving them direction. So I would occasionally stop and show it to them. I would also walk around the classroom so that I could see what they were doing and let them have a closer look at mine. And by doing this, it does a few different things. One, it asks them to really pay close attention to the directions, but it also asks them to put themselves in that position where they really don't know. There's not a step-by-step someone sitting right next to them helping them. And overcoming that kind of frustration is a really important developmental piece for the 7 and 8-year-old. So once most of them had started to get the shape for the head and leaving the space for the body, then we might start talking about legs. Now, I would start by forming the legs and telling them that we'll form the legs as almost like limbs of a star coming off. This would be a very familiar thing. We would have done several other sculptures in this way of bringing out limbs from that shape. We're always trying to keep things relatively large and also trying to keep the surfaces of the sculpture smooth. So they're working the whole and the part simultaneously. Now, by doing this, many second graders may want to do something like this because, of course, their hands really are still building strength. So helping them to balance squeezing and pushing and pulling as all of these different gestures with their hands really will help them to build both skill in sculpture, but also these transferable capacities for hand-eye coordination, fine motor control, and the kind of dexterity, hand dexterity that they'll want in other areas. So this complements the work that they're doing in writing, in drawing, in recorder and flute playing, all of those other small motor fine activities. Now, as they're starting to get then into the shape of the limbs, I would be talking about how the back legs of this frog are really quite strong enough to make it leap more than its own body distance. And that's the kind of thing that's wonderful for the second grader to contemplate, that ability to jump higher than the top of their own head. They love a thought like that. And so by tying that into the strength of the legs of the frog, then they can start to see that we really need to give a little bit of extra material. So I'm moving material from one leg into the back leg and really beginning to draw that leg out. Now, at this point in time, the frog does not have gesture. So we're beginning by creating a frog that is really somewhat splayed, if we were looking at it from adult terms. And the idea here is that for the children, they're creating a sculpture that is not fixed. This is really where you might talk about this activity as being modeling rather than sculpture. They're not coming to a fixed final form. They're creating something that they can then create gesture with. And this is where I really like the modeling beeswax. This works well with clay, but not quite in the same way. And clay, I find, does not offer the same kind of resistance that really helps for the second grader to push their will up against that resistance of the beeswax and have to really work at finding that form. And then also having to keep working the whole thing. One nice thing about beeswax is that if you stop working on one area, it starts to cool and firm up. And that makes it hard to adjust. So the second graders pretty naturally learn that they have to work the entire sculpture the whole time. They can't spend all their time on one leg, or the other legs will become so cool and hard to work that they wouldn't be able to move them. And they also realize pretty quickly that if you bend them when they're all the way cooled or dried, cooled, I suppose, and firmed up, then they'll break. And there's not much that can be upsetting to a second grader like spending a whole bunch of time making a beautiful sculpture only to have it break when they really want to show it to someone. So they'll learn that lesson pretty quickly, to keep warming it, to keep working different parts. You see that my fingers are constantly working. I'm always turning it. And as you're looking at that, those finger movements, that ability is really building dexterity. You'll feel it in your own hands as well, and they will start to. I do occasionally tell them that if their second graders may complain that their hands are starting to hurt. And I'd say that's okay. That's a sign that you're really getting stronger. Anytime you need to, just stop and hold it between your hands. Let it really stay warm and give your hands a chance to rest. And then we can come right back to our work. That way they're also learning to create that space. So by really working in this way, now they've gotten to the point where their frogs are beginning to take some shape. Their upper limbs are a little closer to the head. They haven't left a neck. Then I might start to talk about forming those limbs a little bit more, that the front legs of the frog are a little bit thin, but they have quite a long webbed foot. And that we want them to be matched. So getting some thinner leg capped off by a nice webbed foot. And that's a good pinching activity to really begin to have a sensitivity. You don't want them to always push as hard as they can and flatten everything, but developing that sensitivity, a delicate touch. Then really bringing this together, and we can push the whole frog to compress its body a little. They sometimes will want to get longer. And then really getting into these back legs, keeping a nice strong back leg, bringing it down into a foot. And once they're starting to get to this point, I would be talking about the movement of the frog, about how a frog's legs bend underneath it in order to allow its feet to be flat on the ground while it's pushing off in a jump, like they were squatting down and then leaping up. We would have likely done an activity or some kind of movement in the morning that would allow them to do a leapfrog activity so that they could have a physical sense, a physical memory for what that action would feel like. And that'll help them also to be able to translate it into a sculpture. And then we would talk about what that would be like, that the frog would be laying on its belly, but that we want it to be curled under, so that we want to bring that leg, the back legs, bring them here, find a knee, and then bringing that foot out, flattening as it needs to. I may have over flattened just a little bit so that they can get that shape of the frog leg. And once they've gotten to that shape, then to mimic it on the other side, to bring it forward. There are often lots of jokes among the second graders when they're in sculpture about the ways that the sculptures can bend, the ways their modeling figures can bend. They love to play around with them and bend them into all different shapes. And the better and better they get at sculpture, the more they start to see that every sculpture is a chance to kind of create a toy that they can really play with. This is a really good activity to kind of build with their imagination what they would want to be able to make. I do generally leave sculptures on display after we've put them out so that they can see what everyone else has made. And they are allowed to play with their own sculptures in class, but we do often kind of about half and half of the time. Sometimes we would send sculptures home, and other times we would recycle them into a new sculpture. I think it's good both to give them something to be proud of and to share with their family, to take something home, but also it's also really nice for them not to build up a sense of materialism or connection to the actual object, but to be willing and ready to recycle it, to let it become something new, and to be excited about what it is that they might make next. So by forming these other limbs, now we're starting to get the body shape correct. And I want to start to form the eyes. So pinching on the side of the head to form where their eyes might be. I would talk about how the frog has eyes on the side of its head that really allow it to see all around it. And perhaps a pointed or rounded face. Now, it's not, you can of course see this is perhaps not the most accurate of frogs, but it's really not about accuracy, it's about gesture. And this gesture of a frog right now is fairly stationary, it's pretty still, and that's not something that would appeal very well to a third or to a second grader. They're going to really want something that is lively, that's more moving. And so once I spent some time on the head, and I might come back to this in a moment, then I would talk about what is this frog doing. So most of my class in second grade would want their frogs to be jumping. And so a frog, while it's jumping, might have its front legs extended and its back legs pushing off the ground. And this is where really talking about getting nice thin limbs really helps its frogness. And you can see often what has been formed just gets reformed. And that's all right. That's good for the students to see, especially if you discuss how that's working for yours. I would tell my class, oh, I just folded my foot back into the leg. I'll just reform it again once I have it where I want it to be. Hearing about those kinds of processes, that you as a teacher are not doing things exactly the way you want them to be right away, but rather working with what happens, adjusting, being flexible. That really helps to counter some of that second grade desire for everything to be right away, that desire for the finished effect. So perhaps some legs that are stretching out. And flattening those feet just slightly. I can already see where I need to thin these limbs a little more. They could be thinned to make them closer to the body, but I think I will let that go out into the hands of the frog. And still working on those eyes, still not entirely pleased. Now I don't use a lot of tools, but I do sometimes use a fingernail or things like that. I have to be careful about doing that. Second graders, there were still a good number of students in my class who were biting their fingernails, and so I really made an effort not to use tools that every child couldn't use. Not until they were really given another option. But kids will figure that out. I avoided overly detailing. We do in the second grade, we did start to use multiple other colors. So we might make a white belly, for example, to the frog. I might talk about how when the frog was a tadpole, it had a tail. So as a frog, it would have just a slightly pointed back end. And that would let me push a little bit more into the limbs. And again, looking for what is the gesture of the frog, how is it moving, so that it's not just about a still figure, but about something captured in action. And some of my students really liked the idea that something could stand and it would fall over when you first made it, but if you kept it for a while, then it would begin to have a little bit more stable shape. So they might prop that up. I believe that would be about what I would show for a frog sculpture for the second grade. This is my jumping frog. Feel free to let me know what you think about it, and I hope that it might be helpful to you.